Hi there, I'm Scott Lowe with Actual Tech Media, and thank you for joining us for this Discovery Series video. I'm joined today by Joe Mercis, who is the CEO of CloudDaddy. Joe, thank you for coming to the studio today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
So a lot has changed in the world in the last 15, 20 years, and not just in IT, but across the spectrum. What are some of the big changes you think are impacting organizations today, especially when it comes to things like IT security, the data center, the cloud, all the stuff that they're trying to do around digital transformation, all the things we're seeing today?
Good question. Well, 20 years ago, the entire world was totally different from an IT perspective. Even 10 years ago, the entire world was different. 10 years ago, Amazon Web Services didn't even exist, even though malware was already starting to make its way into computing. And in comparison to today, you've got a total difference in comparison to 20 years ago, 10 years ago, in terms of maintaining business continuity and just maintaining a data center, for example, and ensuring that everything is secure and buttoned down and, protected in terms of everything that's out there today in terms of ransomware. 10 years ago, even, you didn't have the ability to go up on the dark web and pull down source code or even purchase a kit that allows you to create malware and infect systems for profit. And heck, today you even got kits where, you share in the profit making. You can download them, you can implement them, you can push them across the internet, and you and the provider share in the profits of whoever pays a ransom. And today's world is actually pretty scary from a technology point of view, because any system can literally be hacked or infected with a virus or malware or some kind of infection where it's literally exfiltrating data out of your system. And sometimes you don't even know it. A very big concern within government these days is not whether you've been infected, it's whether your data is changing right underneath your nose. So number one, you don't know you're infected, but number two, you're worrying that you potentially are and the data is changing underneath you without your knowledge. So big problem in today's world in terms of dealing with cybersecurity in general.
I think as we think about the world, especially around security, let's step back for a second. One of the things that's really important, I think, to understand is when we used to think about disaster recovery, we thought about tornadoes and hurricanes and floods and fires and all that stuff. Today, disaster recovery is a much wider spectrum. It's obviously that, but it's also recovering from security incidents. And there's been, numerous cases that we've seen in the news about cybersecurity incidents that really truly become DR nightmares. One of them was the city of Atlanta. You want to talk to us a little about what the city went through and sort of what the impact was from their ransomware attack and the fallout?
Sure, and you're absolutely right. So let's go back again 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you're worried about disasters, usually natural disasters impacting your business. And whether you had your tape backups in line where you could literally go off-site, grab a tape, bring it back and restore at that point, right? So you'd be restoring at a specific point in time. In today's world, it's totally different. The disaster that we're talking about is totally man-made. It's not nature-made, for example. So you can potentially get hit with a piece of ransomware that literally is polymorphic, spreads out across your environment, and before you know it, you've got multiple server environments that are infected. Yeah, and they're encrypted at that point, and you're being held for ransom and being pointed to a site. Now, what do you do at that point? And as you mentioned, the city of Atlanta recently faced this exact scenario. So they were infected with ransomware, and before they knew it, from what we read in the media, DMV was down, police didn't have computers, so forth and so on, and they were being held for ransom for a specific amount, which the city of Atlanta, I believe, didn't want to pay. But as soon as they threatened to get the FBI involved and, and different scenarios along that path, the terrorists took away the ability to actually get a password to decrypt those systems. At that point, you're dead in the water, because if you don't have your disaster recovery, your backup policies set and everything in place to recover from that type of a situation, you're dead in the water until you literally restore all of those physical systems back to some point of where they were, close to where they were, potentially not even close to where they were, depending on the data that you've lost, over a period of time. So, in dealing with the city of Atlanta, they lost approximately $3 million ultimately, and potentially more. I don't think the tabulation has been completed yet, just in restoring those systems after the fact and getting different consulting third-party firms involved to assist them in bringing those systems back online. So it's incredible what's happening in today's world.
Were their backups ransomed as well?
I don't know. They didn't say, but you scratch your head and you think about it. Why couldn't they have restored the systems from backup if they were virtual? Should have been pretty quick. And what we found was 3 weeks to a month later, all systems were down. So potentially, this was a major problem for them, whereby these were literally physical systems, not virtual systems. And, they had a major problem in terms of restoring.
And that's one of the challenges with some backup and recovery solutions is that the files are still accessible over Windows shares and things like that. And when you start thinking about how ransomware works, if those are not carefully and properly secured, then they become part of the ransom and you're truly dead in the water.
Yeah, and you bring up another good point. The WannaCry ransomware traversed SMB. So, something that every Windows environment basically had enabled. So you either had the patch installed, and if you didn't, you were susceptible to the WannaCry ransom virus. And, at that point, the ransomware, I should have said, spreads and takes your systems out. And it was most prevalent in Europe. The hospital systems in Europe, in the UK especially, were all down.
They killed people.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't do anything about it. And once again, you have the scenario whereby we're dealing with physical systems. So you're dealing with physical Windows desktops and things of the kind. And once they get ransomed off, and if the servers are actually impacted as well, you're done. Now, back in the old days, 10 years ago, you were most likely doing backups to a tape library, right? You had all of your tape media basically put into cases, so to speak, and you took them off site and you stored them.
Huge air gap.
Yeah, and you rotated them, so they were rotated at specific points in time, and then you brought them back depending on what you needed in terms of restoration. Maybe a server failed, physical servers went down, you had to restore from backup, and you did that. So if you're still doing that today, potentially, depending on what you're being infected with, it can carry through because you literally can be backing up the bad code that infected your systems with, and it's on the tape. So that, in and of itself, is another problem. But the whole scenario today is just being able to protect yourself in terms of preventing ransomware and basically battening down the hatches in terms of loading all the updates, patches, et cetera, necessary on a system in order to protect it.
So let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the barrier to entry for the bad guys these days. It's horrendously low. I mean, basically, what's the phrase? Script kiddies, right? They can go and download this code for free or less than free, or some number like that, and they can be up and running in a few minutes and infecting systems with the help of these hackers. And they create these huge nets and get everybody. Yeah. And it's happening. And organizations are not always as well prepared as they might like to be. And as they continue to spread their workloads out from on-premises to the cloud, it becomes a bigger problem because it can get pretty impactful pretty quickly. Speaking of the cloud, where are you seeing enterprise IT heading with regard to the concept of hybrid cloud and moving into the public cloud? I mean, do you see a lot of clients that are just going wholesale into the public cloud? Are they maintaining a more of a hybrid cloud stance? What are you seeing in your client base as far as the use of cloud goes?
The use of cloud is skyrocketing, and there are multiple reasons for that phenomenon. And if you look at Gartner and IDC, all of the industry prognosticators in terms of looking at the future, they basically state that infrastructure as a service. So this is where, hey, you've examined your own data center footprint, and it's like, hey, listen, I can make it better, faster, cheaper if I just put it up in the cloud. That's skyrocketing, and that's going to continue to skyrocket, according to all of the industry prognosticators out there. And there are a lot of good reasons for that phenomenon happening. One of them is most definitely cost. If you had to basically put out the CapEx to purchase all of your servers, your racks, your PDUs, all the storage that went along with it, and then rack it, stack it, install it, configure it, power it, air condition it, heat it, depending on what your environment is, you're spending a lot of money in terms of CapEx.
Right.
And you can bring up that same environment up in the cloud for a fraction of the cost, and even better, at a subscription price.
Right.
So you don't have to spend all of those thousands, potentially tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, depending on your environment and depending on your data center footprint and depending on your application needs. And you can put that up in the cloud for a fraction of the cost right up front and in a fraction of the time with the same kind of benefit and even more benefit going forward. And one of the benefits that we see is the ability to back up and perform disaster recovery in comparison to traditional and legacy scenarios of the past.
And you mentioned a lot about cost. I mean, obviously, getting things into the cloud, starting an application starting life in the cloud is less expensive to get up and running than starting life in a local data center. But it also comes to a case of simplicity. Being able to go to a console that's somewhere and just fire up as many VMs as you need is a beautiful thing, rather than having to do all the racking and stacking and configuring and getting the networking running and all the other stuff that we had to do in traditional days to get new applications running. So there's a simplicity component too that's important for people to realize, and that's one of the reasons we see so much movement into the cloud. Is you don't need to have all the time wasted set up infrastructure, which means you get quicker time to value for your development efforts as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely
so there's
right.
some incredible business outcomes that we can achieve.
Yeah, I always look at the cloud as better, faster, simpler, and cheaper ultimately. And if you compare the time and the money, and ultimately you'll wind up with the total cost of ownership in terms of the hardware that you're putting in place within your data center footprint, and you compared it up to a subscription model that you'd get from a cloud services provider like Amazon Web Services, you'd notice, wow, it's basically the wow factor in terms of comparison. So there is no comparison at that point. Amazon Web Services is, providing you with all of the hardware necessary, and it's at a hyper scale, meaning that you can basically select to build upon that at a moment's notice. You don't have to tell them, oh yeah, I'm expanding and I want to do this, this, and that, and I want to build this out. You can just do it at a moment's notice, and they have the capacity to be able to build that out for you. And they do it within a moment's notice. So it's incredible.
So we're going to see more and more organizations, especially looking back at the prognosticators you mentioned. I mean, the idea is that we're going to see almost all organizations in some way, shape, or form have a hybrid cloud posture, if they don't already, in the next couple of years.
You're absolutely right, and I'll give you an example. I think it's definitely happening more so within the private sector in comparison to the public sector. The public sector is more security conscious and worried about the security factor in terms of public data, right? And I was a CIO in the public sector for quite some time, so this was always a basic concern. If I put the city of New York's data, for example, up in the cloud, how protected is it?
Right.
And what assurances do I have that it's not going to be compromised in any way, shape, or form? But that adoption is now happening, and it's happening because of the security that's been implemented. You've got a separate area within the cloud called public cloud, right? And you've got private cloud, and you've got areas that are even more tighter in terms of security. Look, even the federal government is now using the cloud, and predominantly now the cloud. Instead of building out a data center, they're choosing to put it up in the cloud. So that speaks volumes in terms of the ability of the cloud to basically overshadow what you can do locally within your own data center, within your own control. You're still in control of everything you've got up in the cloud, but better, faster, simpler, cheaper.
You mentioned the federal government putting things in the cloud from a security perspective. You mentioned that should speak volumes, and it should speak volumes to everyone who has concerns around security in the cloud. I mean, really, quite frankly, for most organizations, they can't get the same kind of security people as cloud providers are going to be able to pay for.
You're right. And let's face it, the federal government, there's a lot of money in the federal government. So they usually have the funding to do what's necessary from their perspective. But city and state governments are different in terms of agencies that potentially may not have the funding. But if you look at the total cost of ownership in terms of doing it on premise versus putting it up in the cloud, it speaks for itself. And the idea now is within city and state governments, if it's good enough for the feds, it should be good enough for city and state governments as well. So if the feds believe that they're protected and it's secure and tight enough, and from a cybersecurity standpoint, it should be good enough for them as well.
And this is actually the introduction for a larger discussion we're going to have around some of the things that Cloud Daddy's bringing to the world, especially to the world of Amazon Web Services. But with that, that's going to wrap up our Setting the Stage video. And Joe, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.